Good evening, everyone. I'm Ryan Roulette, Artistic Director of Roundhouse Theatre. And on behalf of everyone at Roundhouse and the McCarter Theatre, welcome to our third panel of the Work of Adrienne Kennedy, Inspiration and Influence. Tonight's panel is entitled Critical Reflections and will be moderated by Jill Dolan. Dolan is the Dean of the College and the Annan Professor in English and Professor of Theatre at Princeton University. She's the author of many books, including most recently a critical study of the plays of Wendy Wasserstein. Dolan received the George Jean Nathan Award for Dramatic Criticism for her blog, The Feminist Spectator. Joining Jill tonight will be Rohan Preston, the marquee theater critic at the Star Tribune in Minneapolis, St. Paul since 1998. Preston originated and co-produced the Emmy Award-winning A Dream Fulfilled, a Star Tribune documentary on the historic 2008 elections. He also authored the collections Dreams and Soy Sauce, edited the anthology Soul Fires, Young Black Men on Love and Violence, and is currently at work on a hip-hop musical. He has served in the Pulitzer Prize jury for drama and earned his BA in English at Yale. Finally, rounding out our panel tonight will be Regina Victor, a director, multidisciplinary artist, and arts critic who in 2017 co-founded Rescripted, an arts journalism platform by and for artists. Victor has written for many publications, including American Theater, Playbill, and the Chicago Reader. Regina is also the artistic director of Sideshow Theater, and they've collaborated with Steppenwolf Theater, Victory Gardens Theater, Berkeley Rep, Timeline Theater, California Shakespeare Festival, among many others. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and I will let you go and enjoy the panel. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I think we're delighted to be here. Thank you, Ryan, for that very kind introduction. Rohan and Regina and I just met one another, and we're delighted to be here tonight with you to talk about Adrienne Kennedy's work and also to extend our conversation from her work to larger questions about critical engagement with African-American women playwrights and other artists. Maybe we should also note that I don't think we're here as critics of the virtual productions we've seen, but to raise broader questions about criticism in general. And we hope that you'll join us in that conversation. Just a note about the format, we have about 40, maybe 45 minutes of discussion, and then we'll open for your questions. But if you have questions in the meantime, please feel free to put them in the, what is it called, in the comments, and we'll see them and perhaps we can answer them or address them as we go along as well. We're really grateful for your presence here this evening and for your support of this wonderful festival. Thanks to everyone at Roundhouse and McCarter for all their work on producing the plays and the panels. So, to my colleagues, Rohan and Regina, I thought that maybe we could just start with talking about how we were first introduced to Kennedy's plays. I'm curious, and this panel actually made me think myself about when was the first time she kind of came into my consciousness as a playwright. But Rohan, maybe would you like to start?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Kennedy is not produced as much as she should be. And so my introduction is not at a production, but reading Funny House. And that was decades ago. Really just sort of getting a sense both of her imagination, but also of the fact that she occupies these liminal spaces, you know, way ahead in many ways of where our discussion is, and perhaps explaining to a degree the fact that she hasn't been produced as much as she should be. But you know, like the idea of wrestling with the kind of racial identity and Funny House that you have, that's today. You know, it was much less so coming out of the crucibles of the civil rights movement. So it's interesting. It's very interesting. But reading her work has been a richer experience for me in many ways.
I agree. Regina, how about you? When did you first become acquainted with Kennedy's plays?
Yeah, I think, it's very interesting being educated these days as a Black professional. You tend to find things through the grace of your mentors, or through just exposure of doing a lot of reading all of the time. So I wasn't taught Adrienne in high school or college. I encountered it in internships after the fact. So usually reading for season selection, and primarily noticing that often people do not choose to do it. It always comes up in a classic theater context. But when we actually get to producing, usually Funny House is the one that we would read, it doesn't always come to fruition. And so I'm really excited about this event to kind of bring more awareness to her work, because I think that there are so many people who are aware of her work because of what it does for Blackness and for race relations in America in general. But there are also so many people who need to know about it and who are able to avoid it because of the way those topics are organized in our society. So.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I'll just say myself, I too became acquainted with her plays by reading them and then by teaching them when I was teaching, especially race and theater, feminism and theater. And it was really interesting to see how my students at the time responded to the plays, because frankly, they were unlike many of the other plays we were reading at the time, and to the extent that they're non-narrative, non-linear. They were challenging to students on a whole different level, but for that reason, also really compelling, because they gave students a sense of the possibility of the form in a way they hadn't necessarily encountered before. I don't think I myself saw a production of one of her plays until the late 90s or early 2000s. But I wonder, why do you think they haven't been produced as much? Is it because of exactly the things we've been talking about? Is it about the form? Is it about her identity? Is it about the content? And Rohan, as you were saying now, I mean, the plays are so incredibly relevant. And it seems to me that the form is no longer quite the stumbling block that it might have been 20 or 30 years ago for some theaters, not for all theaters. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I'll speak in the abstract here. You have to remember, we live under a tyranny of narrative, right? Mm-hmm. And it's linear narrative. And so if you look at even experimental works happening in the 70s and 80s, she doesn't fit any of that. Look at the downtown stuff. She doesn't fit easily into all of that, because she's creating her form, she's speaking in metaphor, she is writing real poetry, and some of it is very abstract. And so I think narrative, the tyranny of narrative, is one of those reasons. And I also think the fact that she writes in a kind of sometimes a free associative poetry is another.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Regina.
Yeah, I was just taking in that answer. I love the tyranny of linear narrative. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be jacking that. I think, for my part, I think that this is something that I don't know if I necessarily have an answer to. But I think that something I'm noodling on, as I say, is that I think a lot of Black Power movement era plays don't get produced, and I've been thinking about that a lot. So I'm originally from Oakland, California, and so I grew up with Leroy Jones and Mary Baraka's work and things of that nature. And they won their Obie the same year for Funny House of a Negro and The Dutchman. Right. And we don't do The Dutchman as much as I would expect either for the context that we're in. And there's something about that era that the theater was such a political tool. And there was so much happening in terms of organizing and funding Black theaters and Black theaters that were taking off. We have an amazing national precedent of institutions in that time period, that I do feel like there was sort of an annihilation with the annihilation of the Black Power movement of those plays. And I haven't fully fit my brain around that theory, but there's something to that for me in terms of our ability to really look at these fractures of the mind for what they are, right?
Mm-hmm. Can I jump in here? Regina, I totally agree with you. I think that's really an excellent observation. And one of the things about that is the twinning, it's not quite a marriage, but the association of one with the other, like the Black arts movement and the Black Power movement and these particular plays. It's not just these playwrights, but all of these playwrights, beyond them, from this era, they're more often known in the reading than in the seeing. And so, and I think that also has to do with, the vicissitudes and the power structures of the American theater. I mean, that's frankly, that's where we are, and that's a big part of it. But I was having a conversation recently about Dutchman, and thinking to myself, wow, it's I can't imagine this not being on Broadway at this moment. You know what I mean?
Right. Yes, I do.
Do you think if theater were open and live right now, that it would become a part of the Black Lives Matter movement in the way that the Black Arts movement was a part of the Civil Rights movement? I mean, what is the place of that kind of political theater in this political moment, do you think?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say. I feel like we have plays that are doing that are not, for whatever reason, necessarily always on Broadway, but there are plays that are on Broadway that have started to scratch up into that. I feel like I think Katori's take on Tina Turner was very surprising for a lot of people in terms of the story it chose to tell, and it was the emotional story of Tina Turner rather than the chronological story of Tina Turner, which I think was really clever. But I feel like I was thinking about Terrence Arvell Chisholm's work, who wrote like Hooded or Being Black for Dummies and PYG, or The Miseducation of Dorian Bell. Got it. But that play is very fragmented, and the perspectives are very nonlinear. And I think the elevation of the work, something in the feeling of that feels similar. So I do think there are writers that do similar things, but I have a hard time envisioning folks going back in a classic way to Dutchman, or to Funny House, only because the Music Man is contracted right now.
Right.
Indeed.
You know?
But are there other, I guess I'm asking, is there a place for politics in theater, if not on Broadway, other places, to use theater as a way of speaking into the moment or bringing people together around the moment to think about the moment in the ways that some of this work did? I mean, I suppose that's a bit of my hope, is that when we're back to live theater, it'll be a moment for bringing politics and the art together in ways that might be mutually enhancing.
Well, what the interesting thing about this moment, though, in history is that it's not just unprecedented, but it actually is shaping what we go back to. And there's no going back to where we were. There really isn't, because both in terms of the revelations and the fact that everyone can now see in stark terms where we are. And so, returning to status quo is not an option. I say that because theater is a place of tradition and the repertory, right? And so when we go back, and we revive we produce an Adrienne Kennedy play in its fullness. What is it saying to us now? What does it speak to us? That's a question for her plays, but for all plays, right? And in this era, I have to tell you that I recently have been on TikTok and looking at what the young people are doing. And I have a teenager, an 18-year-old, who is always telling me that, not only am I a dinosaur, but, I have no clue, right? And so anyway, I've been on TikTok, and the wit there, the humor there, there's all kinds of stuff there, but is really, really remarkable. And I think there's a fundamental shift because of the digital imagination in how we are today. And I think in some ways it primes us for Adrienne Kennedy's work, right? Because Regina used the word fracture earlier, and that perspective is it's so much of the work that she writes. It's really fracture and refraction, and so we get many, many different views. And I should tell you that I'm here in the Twin Cities, and Penumbra Theater produced the Owl Answers a couple of seasons ago, and it was something, and they produced it in next to Dutchman, and it was something that you had to hold on to because it was like really very trippy and very much, and it was a very beautiful production, but very abstract also. So it's like you're swimming and trying to, find something, to hold on to.
Rohan, can I ask how you see your role as critic vis-a-vis those productions? What do you bring to your work? A kind of pedagogical mind in which you're trying to introduce readers to a playwright they might not know or to a form they might not know? Do you have to switch your approach to the work because of what it is or what you'd like people to get out?
Absolutely. And that's true of anything. If I'm doing a Les Mis, or even a Dutchman, which is better known, then there's a foundation of knowledge there. But with Adrienne Kennedy, you're still introducing her to people, and it's not quite going to a party and say, "Hey, this is so and so," but it's very much in that vein. So yes, and at the same time, you want to show, the real profound engagement. I should step back here and just say, as a critic, what we do is we're serving many masters in a very short space, right? And so artists want some sort of constructive feedback. A lot of readers literally want a consumer guide. Is this something that I can spend this money on and get a babysitter and the parking and the dinner and the whole thing? And then people who read book reviews want to have a sense of what that work is. And then your editor wants something clever and snappy. So you're doing a lot in a very contained space, and you try to dance in it. You try to dance on the beat, if you will, and it's sometimes between it too. And so I see my work in terms of Adrienne Kennedy is as introductory, but also somehow showing the refraction of that imagination. I should say I haven't written a terrible amount about her because her work is not produced enough, and I'm looking forward to that changing, and for us to have a real appreciation of her brilliance.
Regina, how would Rescripted approach Kennedy's plays?
Yeah, I think that a lot of our work is about making sure everybody is on an even playing field. And so working with someone like Adrienne Kennedy's work, you would want to give as much context as you possibly could. Like when we did a review for Colored Girls, I did at Court Theater. And a lot of folks have not gotten to see For Colored Girls, right? Like I've been in more productions and that was my first production that I'd actually seen. And so having that privilege, being able to contextualize that work in a legacy, which I think is our job. And I think you spoke to as well, Rohan, about what historical context are we seated in? What is the legacy? Who has come forward? Who are they inspired by? Where do they sit in history is a big part of a critic's job to me. And I think that with Rescripted, we are literally rescripting the narrative of history in American theater. History is always written by the winners. And so we need different perspectives and to fill in those spaces.
How does it work in the season selection process as well? I'm also interested in how there's a piece of advocacy that goes in all of this. So it's filling in the spaces, but it's also getting the work out so that more people can see it embodied and performed and consume it. How does that, where the contextualizing work fit in a season selection conversation?
Yeah, I think speaking from the basis of a classic theater, right, which is usually the space, which I also think is funny because to me it is so contemporary in terms of the work, but that's just where it's been interrogated at so far in my life. Usually the advocacy or the context that comes with that is the need for people to know history. I mean, the first time that I read it, I was so frustrated that I did not know who this person was, and no one had shared that with me. And even in fact, right now, I think the need for education is so deep. This is the first time that I have had reason to speak in a public forum about Adrienne Kennedy. And I can see that a white woman in the chat told me how to pronounce her name, which for me is emblematic of the kind of knowledge hoarding and the sharing that we need to be doing with communities so that we can actually participate in this the same way as some of the intellectual elite. You know, it's really fascinating to me. So I think that was the main point of advocacy, is that they are every man plays and every femme plays, and they are not often given to the people.
Mm-hmm. What role, I was trying to remember if the plays when I taught them were published or where they were published. I was interested in what you said, Rohan, about theater being, of course, a business, and the whole sort of circle of marketability, these questions of canonicity, of how plays even get circulated to be read in ways that people find out about them and therefore produced, or vice versa. But I'm wondering where there might be other places of intervention to do the kind of work you're doing, Regina, or to stage the kind of conversations that you're staging, Rohan. Is it community-based? Is it, you know, where do you see points of intervention?
Well, I would say, I mean, some of it is the education piece. I mean, literally, the people in the business who are running the business sort of have to step up and you know, create a space. I mean, it's a hard business, and it operates on a knife's edge. Now is a time of retrenchment. You know, the pandemic has caused devastation across the industry. And, you know, companies have had to slash their budgets by 60%, or sometimes more. Some are going out of business. So it looks like at this time it may not be the opportune time, but I think it is. You know, part of, not just because the work is relevant and the ideas are relevant, but the standard thing has been to shed areas of that are deemed quote unquote non-essential, or you know, we can't do that. We have to go with what's assured right now. But I think again, the models are all smashed, and now is the time. So the short answer is the leaders of the industry have to lead. They have to produce the plays and educate the public, expose people to this work. And it's not just Adrienne's work or Charles Fuller or any number of these playwrights. It is because I get back to that word tyranny, or lack of imagination, but we live in a culture sometimes where it's pretty easy. It's like, you know, I look at the seasons that are announced in American theater across the country, and I'm shocked sometimes, actually, because, you know, there's a kind of a sameness to them, sometimes a lack of imagination. And I don't know if, you know, I'd love to see, and perhaps Regina, you can help me here, because you plan seasons. You know, it's like, you know, is there a slot for the blockbuster? Is there a slot for the experimental work that's paid for by the, you know, it's like, how do you even this out over a season?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really interesting question too, about how do you round it over a season, right? Because I think sometimes what we come up against is that the mission of our theater, right, it may not per se fit with an aesthetic or with a demographic or with a time period, whatever it may be, right? It can be as specific as one of my favorite theaters here, Timeline Theater, right? They do mainly plays on a line of history that have strong dramaturgical roots, right? Sideshow theater, we're a little bit looser, so it's theater for the curious. Exciting to me, and I think is a foundation for a lot of theaters, regardless of their mission, Because the thing that struck me as you were talking is if you are asking real questions about our society, it will lead you to this work. Right? All roads will lead back to Fuller, Kennedy, Shange, et cetera, right? And I think that ultimately that leads to artistic leaders being able to do what they want in terms of programming and to follow the questions that their artists are actually asking of them. We see from things like the We See You documents, the type of interrogation that artists are actually ready for, both in terms of politics, as you mentioned earlier, and in terms of art and how those things overlap from an artist's ability to shape a society. So it's about us talking about our theaters that way as tools to shape society and tools for conversation, rather than presentation or rather than a business.
Just to follow that a bit more, how do you create a condition in which audiences are curious and want to be part of the conversation? And is there a role for the critic in that project?
I love that question.
I love the notion of theater for the curious.
Yeah, well, I think at Sideshow, and I've just taken this post a couple of months ago, so I'm going to speak a little bit about me as an ensemble member in that time there, as well as where we're going. But I think for us, it's really landed in not being beholden to a particular aesthetic. Like, we know that we want to do things that are a little bit more idea-based, right? Ideologically based. We're asking a question about an idea rather than a social situation most of the time. So that might affect our aesthetic and how much realism we do. But apart from that, we're able to adapt a classic. We are able to do a play about North Korean expatriation. We are able to do a play about Black Lives Matter juxtaposed with Tilikum, the whale at SeaWorld, and being in cages, right? We can have a wide breadth of questions that are in response to our audience and to our artists, right? And I think being an ensemble theater, it connects you to community too in a different way, right? Where our artists are kind of our audience at the same time, and they represent our audience in a specific way. As for the critic part of that question, I think what's interesting about that is it's scary to ask questions as a critic in a public space, especially if you're new at it. And I will speak for myself. But I think that once I started writing for, the Reader, for American Theater and HowlRound, like the types of questions I asked, the stakes got much higher in terms of, do we need this type of theater anymore? Saying, do we need this type of theater from a certain company might mean that company economically suffers, and that carries a different kind of weight. So I think giving critics a little more freedom by taking away some of the economic responsibility would allow them to be more curious, to be honest.
I would second that. Slight modification. I do think that just our own curiosity as critics and our openness to every type of theatrical experience helps us and helps our readers as well create this appetite. I'm endlessly curious just about the whole field, about the magic that happens in theater, and I go into the theater if it's something that I've seen a million times. I go in and like that old commercial for that soap, I say, Calgon, take me away. I really want to. I don't want to prejudge what's coming, and I want to have a new and renewing experience. And I think our readers can also are interested. They want to be surprised. The theater founder, Tyrone Guthrie, used to tell his actors, astonish me in the morning. And I think that is a really wonderful motto, and sort of a guide of how to live your life, a life of renewal, of endless surprise and growth. And I that's what I ask of the theater, and that's what I ask of everything. I mean, because there's no destination, right? It's just like a series of trips, and enjoy the journey.
Is that your experience as well, Regina?
It is. I love that idea about a series of trips. That is just so cool with no destination, because I think we can get very product based, which I think is what I was alluding to before. And I feel like if we are able to just take that step back, as you say, and I always joke that I watch plays like a little kid. Because otherwise I'm doing the artist thing, I'm like, how's that actor? I want to use that movie to do that thing, so to turn my brain off, I really do just go in and I'm like, wow, like, look at that light and look at this. And I think it helps to be open and to do the intellectualizing of where does it fit in history later, once you've digested what you've seen. But giving things a chance, I think, is a skill that you have to cultivate without preconceived notions, and this gives me a way to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And it carries over into everything, right? I mean, it carries over into conversations with, people who are like politically opposite or from you and who may have ideas that literally threaten your life. And you're like, okay, I'm curious because my life depends on it, right? And so can we talk, or am I going to be harmed in this process? And so I mean, it's a fascinating, and again, this is the moment we're in, where all of these things are on top of each other, and where the political season is endless, and where it's existential, and so it's like it's a fascinating thing. It's like we're talking about theater. I happen to think that the arts are in the center of the room and should be. There are many people who believe otherwise, but and so we're talking about theater, but we're really talking like a larger conversation about things such as equity, and larger conversation about things such as the state of our society. And how we live up to our ideals. And so theater is just one refraction of that. And Adrienne Kennedy, I love the word refraction, by the way, so I'm trying not to use it too many times. Regina, thank you so much. I'm trying not to use it too many times. But theater is just one way of reflecting that,
Yeah.
Can I ask a question about place? Because, of course, here we are engaging this festival of necessity on digital formats that actually take away some of the specifics of place that I think inspire the kind of curiosity, as well as the kind of refractions and fractures that you're both talking about. How does your experience of this work or other theater work digitally make you think differently about the relationship between these arts, or the very specific work that the theater does that we're missing right now with regard to some of these questions like curiosity and being astonished and those sorts of things?
Yeah. Go ahead. You go first.
Can I just jump in? So I've been wrestling with that question, not just in this context, but in general, since we went digital. And went to streaming, and I love Indonesian shadow puppetry, right? Which is very interesting stuff, and shadow puppetry in general is interesting, and to a degree, I think that's like a metaphor for what's been happening, because theater is three-dimensional, and I literally love being in the same room, breathing the same air. If someone is on stage and they say, I am now on this train and I'm shaking my way through the Alps or whatever, I believe, right? And if someone does that on stage, on Zoom, it looks like there's an issue there. There's a problem. There's because we're trained and taught to have a suspension and a disbelief in one realm, and in another realm where we have a demand of accuracy, or some sort of reality. And so we are in this moment at this time, and I've been wrestling with this my own self, because I really have a hard time reviewing a Zoom production. I can't do that, and it's like it's not meant to be. That is not to say that they're not innovations and people are not doing interesting work and all of that. But I personally struggle with that. So and I'm not calling what people are doing on Zoom or in streaming less than, but I'm just saying it's a different thing. And so if I relate it to shadow puppetry, it's not meant to be an insult. It's just to explain, sort of the translation into a different medium.
Mm-hmm.
It's really cool. It's a really cool metaphor. I've struggled with this a lot, because I'm of two minds. Like, I think everything that I have done on Zoom has gratefully been very well attended. And I don't necessarily go to a bunch of stuff on Zoom. And so it's been something that, as someone who is programming things that will be on Zoom, I needed to get to the bottom of for myself. And I think the thing that I love about that metaphor is the two questions that I've come up with that still make Zoom theater worth engaging with to me is, what would I do and how would I feel? Those are like the two questions that we love answering in the theater. So it's that moment of response. You're like, oh my God, what would I do? What are they going to do? Right? And so if you can create that feeling in Zoom theater, which I think people are very able to do, things like place become less important. Now, I will say it depends on what you're doing. Because like if everything you're doing is dependent on the environment, it's going to be a trickier thing to translate rather than focusing on something that's about the feelings between two people, right? I saw a joke on #book that was like, that background really made me feel like I was in Pittsburgh, girl. But it's true, yeah.
But there are, again, there are possibilities there. And so, people are discovering new things. I mean, Zoom is amazing because it's going to cut down on travel budgets, and not cut down travel budget, but the need to travel when you can have a meeting and you can gather like this. And there are other opportunities that are just coming to the fore. So, I mean, again, there's no going back to what we were. We have this new tool and series of new tools and technologies that are amplifying our existences, and we're going to use them,
I think that's right. One thing I was thinking when I was watching the Kennedy plays is when you're in a theater, your eye can go wherever it wants. And because her work, the literature of her work is so nonlinear and fractured, it kind of, the plays I've seen directed invite your eye to look at different things at different moments. So that sense of possibility for the spectator, I think, is a bit lost on Zoom just because of necessity. There's a camera there. So the difference between the mediums or the media become quite pronounced, I think, especially working with texts like these. Go ahead, Regina.
I was just, you make me think about it. I love these questions because I'm having so much fun, Jill. But I think from a directing standpoint, because I've been thinking about, how easy is it for us to transfer to Zoom as directors?
Yeah.
And the thing that I've had to focus in on, because I feel like I direct one of two ways, right? There's sort of the open hand, you craft the world of the play lives on its own and it breathes on its own, and people kind of make the play on what they're focusing on, right? Or there's that like forced perspective type of directing, which can veer into the filmic sometimes, right? Of we're really zooming in over here, we're using the slide effect over here, or pieces of the stage are dark, however someone may choose to do that. And I feel like the latter works better for me on Zoom. I feel like you can create things where I know where I'm looking, especially if you're bold enough to keep everyone on screen at the same time. You can create some interesting things, but it's an interesting question for me in terms of inclusivity in the industry and how we work going forward, because they are just two different valid styles.
I do think film theater audiences actually resent that. Because they're accustomed to basically looking everywhere. And so the idea that you're being channeled here, around and into specific places, they're accustomed to essentially constructing the play for themselves.
This is true. They're different spectatorial experiences. Go ahead, Regina.
I just was struck by that because I think that is so emblematic to me of also like the way our audiences were before we folded, in terms of that, like the ability to sit back, but also like own the play in a way, or decide what the play is. And I'm working on a play that is very much trying to subvert that right now, Jeanette the Musical, with Lauren Gunderson and Ari Afsar. And a lot of that is about how do we focus in on what we want people to leave the theater knowing, because in a Broadway musical, it would be very easy to decide what kind of play you just watched, right? And to whatever we're trying to say. So I just found that to be really fascinating. Yeah.
Let me turn to some of the questions that are coming up in the comments so that we can make sure our audience gets their questions answered. There's a question about the non-linearities of Kennedy's plays and whether or not that's a factor in why they weren't produced more. And the question goes on, as you can see, to ask, would her impact have been greater had she written plays that are more producible, which a word I'm glad is in scare quotes, because I do think that word is laden with implications, isn't it? But what, Rohan, maybe you could start with what you think about that.
I don't know what more producible is. I mean, it's, you know, I wouldn't second guess anything. But what I will say is that what's happening now, and it gives me great hope for the theater, is there is a sense that there's a wider palette being accepted, and so I don't think the problem was with her work and with her being producible or not. I think the challenge was that the vision was not there in the wider leadership of our nonprofit resident theaters to embrace and to have capacity for that kind of work and that kind of experimentation. Because you have to remember, you know, Kennedy is an experimental playwright. You know, I mean, we look at her as a classic writer today, but I mean, she had, you know, sort of experimental works, but it didn't fit into the type of experimental works that we're accustomed to, right? And it didn't fit into some of the downtown scene, or, you know, it didn't fit into the avant-garde. It wasn't Wooster Group or anything like that. So what do you do with this? You know, and I think that's some of the question. I have a different example of something that I experienced when I first experienced this in college. That like all the it was in music, and we had like disco and hip hop and R&B and rock and blues and all of that, but the idea of a Black experimental genre didn't exist. You know, and so it's like, how do you have a playwright like that, like Adrienne Kennedy, or how do you have someone like Tracy Chapman? And she didn't break through, you know, but it's like, you know, didn't fit or Michelle Ndegeocello, right? She doesn't fit the mold. You know, she's experimental, and it's like, okay, where are we going to put her? So the question may have to do with the boxes that we have, and creating a space for someone who doesn't fit any of those boxes.
I think the only thing I would really add to that, because I think that's really beautiful, is I think that I don't know that she would have been produced had she written to be more producible. And I don't think that she would have achieved the longevity she has now. Change the way that she wrote. You know, I think what you said at the beginning of our conversation, Rohan, about how her work has sort of persisted in this way, in this timeless way. And it feels like right now, it'll keep coming back around because of its specificity in that way.
There's another question in the comments about what were the plays, this is AJ Asante, what were the plays of the Black Arts Movement doing that we still need now? That seems to pertain to your response about Kennedy, Regina.
Yeah. Okay. I was thinking about this actually, and we were talking about it earlier, and why that moment sort of paused, right? And I think that the Black theater movement, you know, there was sort of this cascade of minstrelsy and of the entertainment that we know pre-World War II. And after World War II, it was like, we're not really doing this anymore, right? We're going to get the federal funding together. We're going to make councils. We're going to take this over. And it was highly successful, right? You have like Black Arts Rep. You have Ed Bullen's just play after play, which is also a contemporary of Adrienne's work. And I think that it forced us to look at what our country actually was in a way that prompted its halting. And I feel like now I wonder if we're ready to face it willingly, because as Rohan said earlier, everything is kind of broken. The models are smashed. What do we have to lose by actually examining the question at the core of the thing as we rebuild? So I think that is what we need right now, is some breaking open of who we thought we were, of the illusions that we live under as a country. And I think this work does that.
Very helpful. So back, I think, to this question of producibility and experimentation and boxes, Bonnie has a question in the chat about whether Adrienne Kennedy's work is usually based on true things that happened to her or things she heard about. And there is a thread of autobiography in the work too. So I wonder if you could comment on the interesting mix of a kind of autobiographical truth with a very innovative, sometimes not tyrannically narrative form, and how those things work together.
I have a shorter answer. I feel like Mr. Preston's going to lay me out with this answer, so I want to get to that one. But I feel like there is sort of an ancestral truth, I'll call it, I think, that rings through these plays. So autobiographical, I feel like those pieces feel like they could be happening to me too, in certain spaces. And that's really what I have to contribute about that.
Yeah, I would say I agree. Regina, I think it's a really excellent answer. They feel to me that they have a truth to them on stage, or when I read them, and why they resonate is because they're very specific, and they also are true in the sense that other people can experience that kind of, I guess it's distantiation is a word, or that kind of shift in like, did that just happen? I mean, we talk about microaggressions today. There's a number of that loaded into her work, and it's like, if it's like, what's the motivating action? Well, some microaggression just happened, or something traumatic just happened, and so I get that sense from her. I want to say, and this jumps off a little bit, that I saw Claudia Rankine's work over the last year and a half, and I welcome her, because in some ways, and I don't even know if she would admit this, but she is like, the daughter of Adrienne Kennedy, right? In terms of wrestling with some really intense and very poignant ideas, but also with a kind of fearlessness. She has a white card, and she was doing this other play, whose title I don't remember right now, but she was mentioning that she told me, like, oh, it's going to be 17 white men and 1 Black woman on stage. And she's like, all my Black friends in the theater are like, what about those jobs? But she's like, this is the thing I need to make this point on it, So I think that courage is clearly also, it's not just limited to one person, but I do think that she is relevant, like Adrienne Kennedy is relevant in so many ways, and also she has seeded the field as well.
That's a lovely way of putting it. There's another question in the chat about, back to virtual performance, Daniela's question about the reception of virtual plays, or when they're performed virtually. The impact of the actor's words can be so much more intense as audience members watch and react from a safe space. but how do performers, obviously that exchange between performer and spectator that happens in such a visceral way in the live isn't there. And yet at the same time, it's a good question because it sort of begs the issue of how the mutuality of the virtual experience and where it happens and if it happens. Does it happen from criticism after the fact? Does it happen in a more privatized way with the person you're watching with? Does it happen through some exchange between spectator and performer after the play? Although I would say spectators so rarely write to performers, which is another thing I wish would happen. Instead of standing out there at the stage door like they do on Broadway, there should be more ways for audiences and artists to speak with one another, in my humble opinion. But what do you think about this question of the impact, the mutual impact in the digital form? I guess, Regina, you've been doing a lot of Zoom directing, so I'm sure you've thought about this.
Yeah, okay, I was thinking about something silly. I'm not going to lie to you, so I have to start with that now.
Share it, please.
But I'm half serious in that I started out as an actor, and I've been lucky to do some stuff actually since this started because availability has become easier on Zoom. But what's interesting about it is the audience, and I don't mean to tell on us, but we don't really engage with you that much. Like I feel you, and I love that you're there, but I'm usually trying to lock in on somebody and everything. I rehearse that whole time with them so I can stay here the whole time that this is happening. And so while it is harder in that you don't necessarily figure out the rhythm of a show, so like a comedy or a tragedy or the space that an audience sort of creates in the character that they play is certainly absent. And so a director sort of has to build those things into the Zoom experience, whether by making the other performers the audience, which I've seen a lot in a little bit, or by creating those moments in reaction shots almost can help to fill those spaces. And I think the chat function has been really successful for a lot of audience participation. Like, I had a friend who said that it feels a lot like church now when we are talking in the chat, because you can be like, amen, that's great. Oh, I see you. Oh, no, he's not. Like, you can do all the things you would say in a movie theater, but it's all in the chat and you're not distracting a performer. So I've also seen audiences really enjoy that. And as a spectator, sometimes I like being able to remove myself that 1 degree of having an emotional response around a ton of people. That is kind of nice. Yeah.
That's interesting. Rohan, do you have any ideas about this?
Yeah, I do. I was thinking about how it's both more focused in that you're just like, it's just you and the screen as an audience member, but also in some ways it could be less so because you're accustomed to being distracted. And, having the dog run by or, having someone or the phone ring or something like that. And so it's this tension of more and less. It's this push-pull at the same time. But again, I do think it's an opportunity and it's a cause for learning. And so when we go back to, being fully three-dimensional in the theater with other people, sharing the same air and breathing the same breath, there should be learnings as well.
I think that's right. It occurs to me as you're talking, I miss the ritual of theater. I miss going, I miss entering the space, I miss sitting in my seat, I miss looking around, I miss, watching something happen to there's something about inviting the experience into my everyday space and watching theater on the same exact box that I watch television and the news and things like that, that I just miss the extraordinariness of the rituals that the presentness of theater requires for me, even though now I know the audience, the actors don't care that the audience
we do care.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I do miss that rubbing shoulders with people, even when I'd rather be private or have even the mandatoriness of it. There's something that I really miss about gathering with strangers, gathering with people I know. Yeah.
I mean,
I was going to say, I agree. I totally agree. And but I have to say though, I mean, I love the panels that have been gathered on Zoom. I love
Yes.
the way the technology is being used. I love meeting both of you here. I thank, Roundhouse and McCarter, for coming together on this really important work. And I think there are probably more people on here now because of we're able to do more. But again, I mean, I'd love to see this particular festival recreated 2 or 3 years down the road, where we get a kind of a critical mass, we produce the plays and have a celebration around it in person and with the broadcast branches as well.
Wouldn't that be wonderful? That's such a great invitation to the future, I think, and a great way of thinking about how to make the best of this complicated present. I think we're almost at time, but I have to say, I love the idea of creating new boxes, of thinking outside the boxes, which both of you have helped us do so beautifully tonight, of honoring Adrienne Kennedy and her work, and knowing, I think, that it'll have a future because of festivals like this and conversations like this. And also the theater will have a different kind of future, and the rituals will be different. And hopefully, as you both have said, we'll bring what we learned when we're back in some dramatically, if you will, reconfigured way. This conversation has made me feel very hopeful, and I really appreciate the insights from Rohan and Regina. Thank you so much. I think Ryan is going to pop back on at this point. Is he there? There he is.
I am. And
we can do this on Zoom too.
Regina, I know you had one other thing that you wanted to add.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're great, Jill. This has been so delightful. I just wanted to comment on what you were saying about the ritual in society. I think what I hear from that is just a desire to return to our society, right? To choose to go to the theater instead of to choose to watch a movie is to choose to participate in society. And for that reason, our theater will continue because we will always make that choice. And I just love that you shared that. Thank you both.
I just want to say thank you to all three of you for a truly fascinating panel. I could listen. I mean, it's funny, during COVID, time doesn't always mean much. I always joke that, I look at the clock and think it's midnight and it's 6 o'clock at night. But this kind of conversation just reminds me so much of what I love about theater. What's great about it is that, Rohan, you're in Minneapolis, Regina, you're in Chicago, Jill, you're in New Jersey. But what stinks about it is that we can't all applaud you right now, and I can't take you into the lobby and buy you a couple of drinks and keep this conversation. So
another time.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Nice to meet you.
This has been a joy. Wonderful to meet everyone as well. So thank you.
You all too.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.